Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome in. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the third session that the National AI Centre, in partnership with Standards Australia, is delivering on responsible and inclusive AI. My name is Matthew Payne, and I am a Senior Project Manager in the Standards Development Department with Standards Australia. And my role is to work directly with our technical committee, who leads Australia's interests in the Standards Development Forum at an international level. I will keep my introduction very brief. I will just go through a few things, but first I would like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the lands from which I am coming and hosting this session from today, which is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which you are all joining us from around the country today, and we pay our respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. A few details about what we're going to go through today. There will be some polling that happens because we want this session to be as interactive as possible with our audience. So please endeavour to answer the polls to help us understand what everybody is doing with AI and inform us for future sessions. There'll be a brief overview of the work program that's underway at the moment at the international level where we are participating. And then there'll be an open discussion led by the committee chair, Aurelie Jacquet, where we'll be talking about defining responsible and inclusive AI, human-centered design and AI, and some forms of bias with AI. And then there'll be some questions from the audience at the end. But as I alluded to, we want it to be interactive. So there is a chat function, so please communicate with one another, communicate with your fellow audience members. There is a poll that will do a couple of questions throughout the hour. And then there is a section for submitting questions that our panelists will endeavour to answer throughout the session. We'll briefly throw to my colleague from the National AI Centre, Beth Worrell.
Thank you, Matt. Hello, everyone. I'm joining you today from Ghana land down here in South Australia. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands and waters upon which we meet today. I joined the CSIRO National AI Centre a few months ago, and it's a delight to be joining to welcome you all to this session today. I'm joining the National AI Centre to lead the Responsible AI Network, and so we are delighted to work with partners like Standards Australia, including a range of other partners as well, to give you access to some of these types of webinars. We're also planning a set of events and activities going forward into next year. So we would love to hear from you if there are particular areas of responsible AI that you are interested in addition to the events that we're putting on today. So please get in touch with us and join the community. We would love to hear from you and have you part of this group as we move forward for this exciting opportunity for Australia. Enjoy the session today. Look forward to hearing about your questions, and over to you, Matt.
Thanks very much, Beth. And just quickly before we go to our panel, the first poll is open now, so we would love for you to participate in this for us. The question is, are you using AI? If yes, in what context? So please, we would love some audience engagement in this. The poll will be open for a little while and we'll announce some of the results as we progress through the session. But it is my pleasure to introduce the host of today's session, Aurelie Jacquet. Aurelie, over to you.
Thank you, Matt. Good afternoon to everyone. So today for you, before we get a bit deeper into what responsible and inclusive AI is and the work of that, all our experts here have been leading in their day-to-day work, but also with the international standards. What I want to do is to give you a very good and short overview of what it is that is doing on AI. So if we go on to my next slide. What are standards on AI? What do we do with participating? Well, the international standards on AI, for which all the experts here are involved. They're actually leading international best practice on AI. We providing guidance on all the aspects, the data aspects, the model aspect, and the governance aspect of AI. We have currently 20 standards published that cover, as I say, the data, the bias of AI, but also the risk management piece, and looks at ethical implication and societal implication of AI. So there's a tendency to think that standards is just a technical as just a technical aspect, but no, the work that we do goes beyond that, beyond the technical aspect. It looks at organizational governance and process that organization can have in place. There's 30 standards that are still being developed on AI. There's 59 countries that are involved, so one of the largest international initiative. We have 3 experts here that are looking at SC42 standards, so mostly focused on AI. And we have 1 international expert here with us on this panel, Jonathan, that is actually looking at the human aspect when interacting with AI system. So we're just very lucky to have all our panelists today as part of the 150 experts that are working and doing really important work on AI and establishing the benchmark. All our work also is not done just in vacuum. We're working with major international initiatives like the OECD, ITU, the Partnership of AI, and the European Commission. The European Commission been involved in our conversation since 2018. And I guess it's no surprise if you look at the EU AI Act, the latest version, it's actually got over 50 mention of standards. And obviously, we have 1 standard that's upcoming that's looking at the certification of AI. That's the AI Management System Standard. So it's looking at the certification piece, but it's leveraging all the broader work that we've done. So this is to give you a very high-level summary of how effectively the international standard on AI help with the interoperability of all the different requirements that we see developing in many jurisdictions, and how experts are working together to establish the baseline for AI system. Next slide, Matt. And effectively, as I said, like the focus, how the standards are working to develop inclusive and responsible AI practice. It's because they provide an AI assurance framework, because they look at the data, they look at the model, and they look at the organizational governance. And you see there are many initiatives that are leveraging the work of ISO. There's in the US, there's a certification, there's an independent certification that's built on the standards. The EU, as I mentioned, is referencing the importance of standard generally, not just ISO, but just the standards that they look to build. And we have a strong relationship with between the EU standards body and ISO. And obviously, in Australia, you would have seen that the New South Wales AI Assurance Framework also referred to as international standard on AI. So that's to give you a very quick summary of really what the experts, the standards expert and our Australian expert have been up to in relation to defining best practice for AI. So without further ado, I will move out. Sorry, I forgot this one last slide. If I to summarize in just a few words what standards are doing, effectively, they just rely on that 3R formula. And if you press the next button, thank you, Matt. It's really developing robust, repeatable process that are recognized internationally to develop responsible AI. That is an AI that is also inclusive. So as I say, without further ado, I'll pass on to our experts and we'll start diving a bit more into the conversation on what it means to have and implement an AI or AI systems that are responsible and inclusive. So what I want to say is we are very, very lucky today. We have such a, we're going to have such a multidisciplinary expertise, and I will let the panel members just introduce themselves because I would not do them justice. So, Jonathan, do you want to start and introduce yourself?
Thank you, Aurelie. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good to be with you. My name is Jonathan Earthy. I currently work for an organisation called Lloyd's Register. Now, what we mainly do is assure the technical quality of ships. But for 30 years, which is as long as I've been with Lloyd's Register, we're trying to make sure that the people who are on ships and also manage ships are integrated with the technical systems. That's my day job. That gives me an example to work on when dealing with AI, because in that sector, we're increasingly using AI as any other sector. But also, the hat I'm wearing today is as chair of ISO TC159, which is ergonomics, SC4 human system interaction. And I'll be speaking about the standards that we're developing and the perspective we have on human system interaction today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm so happy to have you here today and at this time, so really appreciate. Dr. Kate Bauer. Kate, up to you.
Thank you, Aurelie, and I'm very excited to be here. I also wear many hats. I'm a consumer advocate, and my main job is a consumer data advocate at Choice, which is Australia's largest consumer advocacy organisation. We're there, lead a team where we work on issues to do with AI and automated decision making, particularly in essential services and where people might interact with AI in their everyday lives. But I'm currently undertaking a fellowship with the UTS Human Technology Institute, which is one of the partners of the knowledge partner of the Responsible AI Network that Beth mentioned earlier. And that's to work on a policy project around the future of AI regulation. I'll probably be able to speak to a bit of both of those things. And as Aurelie mentioned, I'm a member of the Standards Committee and also a member of the NAIC think tank. So yes, lots to do with AI and standards across my many hats. But here mostly today I'll be speaking, representing the consumer perspective.
Thank you, Kate. Now we'll hear from Dr. Eric Quinn.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Aurelie. So I'm Eric. I'm currently the head of regulatory and quality at franklin.ai. So I was in the same role previously at our sister companies, Annalise and Harrison AI, which you might have heard of. So we're a group of companies who develops basically AI as medical device and IVD products. We're based here in Sydney. And prior to joining Harrison, I actually worked at the TGA, which is the Therapeutic Goods Administration, which is the medical device and medicine regulator here in Australia. So for a number of years, so I'm fortunate enough, I guess, to have perspectives from both sides of the fence. So yeah, I'm very excited to be here to share some of my experiences and also to learn from the other panelists. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Eric. And last but not least, Sarah Dods. Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Aurelie. There is a doctor there as well. It's all right. It's just not on the page. So good afternoon, everybody. I work for GHD in my day job, which is an engineering professional services firm. So Australian born, but now global with 11,000 employees on 5 continents. My background in AI is I've led AI teams in healthcare, in research, in the corporate world around financial services and some of the fraud use cases. And now really enjoying looking at the engineering perspective around water, energy and community infrastructure use cases. Looking forward to being here today and hearing from other panelists. And I've got a particular interest around IoT and technical documentation and computer vision aspects of AI. My involvement in standards is in Working Group 2, and that is the standard Aurelie put up earlier, which is around the data quality systems to support AI.
Thank you, Sarah. I did promise you, and I was not lying, we have 4 doctors looking at very, very different aspect and multidisciplinary aspect of AI. So this conversation, I can't wait to get started on this conversation. So I'll start with you, Kate. When we're talking about responsible inclusive AI, what does it really mean from a consumer's perspective?
Well, I think, yeah, it's a great question to think about. What does it feel like and look like for consumers? So I think if you ask the average person on the street, do you use AI? What do you use AI? And I just had a little peek at our poll numbers here, and some people are saying they don't use AI. Some people are saying they use it for administrative tasks. So I think now, probably with the hype that we've seen around ChatGPT over the last 6 months, that's what people tend to think about when they think about AI. But actually, AI is everywhere, all around us. It's in so many consumer products and services. You know, just coming into work this morning, I, was trying to get my daughter out the door, and I said, "Hey, Google, turn off the TV," because she'd snuckily put on some cartoons while she was eating her breakfast. That's AI. Then I was listening to Spotify on my way to work. It's algorithmic curated content. That's AI. My daughter was watching Netflix. That's AI. Hop on the train. The transport system is using AI to make sure the trains get to the place they need to get to on time. Doesn't always work that well in Sydney, I have to say, with a Sydney City Rail. So actually AI is all around us. And what this says to me is that consumers actually don't know when they're interacting with AI and when they're not. And that has particular implications for how consumers understand and interact with AI products and services. So one of the things I think about when I try and talk about AI from the consumer perspective is traditionally we're used to engaging in our consumer rights and consumer choice through the consumer law framework and through consumer guarantees. And what this means is that we frequently know when a product or a service that we've bought has failed and how it failed and if it has been harming us. So if we compare our kind of traditional view of consumer law and product safety, for example, let's buy a heater from a store, we take it home, it's faulty, it sets our house on fire. We know that fire has been caused by the heater and we know what the potential harms are. But because AI is often happening in the background and consumers don't know that they're even interacting with it, it's very, very difficult for them to know that they've been harmed or to understand how they've been harmed. And then if they do understand that, there's often a lot of opacity and lack of transparency around what's happening behind the scenes. So, for example, we don't know how Netflix decides which things to show us and which don't. And quite frequently, that's not particularly very harmful. But when we see AI operate in other certain contexts, for example, I could mention Choice's work around facial recognition use in retail spaces and in stadiums, where that lack of transparency becomes very significant on people's privacy rights, also on their human rights. And we can begin to see where this kind of creates a problem. So going back to the fire example, the other thing that I like to think about is the scale of AI is quite unique. So because of, the benefits can be widespread, but it also means that the harms can be widespread. So if something goes wrong in an AI system, and we saw this with Robodebt, though not technically AI, if I'm going to be technical about it, but a system that's using automated decision making, you can see that the scale of the harm can be quite widespread. So it's not a single house fire, it's thousands of house fires, millions of house fires happening to people all at once. So basically what I think this means, going back to this issue of responsibility, is that consumers have lost some of their powers to enact their consumer guarantee. So they don't know when a product has failed necessarily or when it's harming them. And that means that their version of redress is not available to them. So they can't get their refund, they can't get their, repairability that they would normally have with the standard product or service. So what that means in terms of responsibility is that it's much, much more important that businesses act responsibly right from the get-go, right from the very, very beginning of the development of a product that includes AI and that is data-driven. So I don't know how we're going for time, but I'll see if I can give you an example from Choice's work on this. So one example that I'll raise is last year, Choice did an investigation into Airbnb and their use of potentially a trustworthiness algorithm to determine who people should be on the platform or not be on the platform. And we had a particular case study of a woman who was down in Victoria who had been using Airbnb for years and one day got an email from Airbnb that said, we're removing you from the platform. Please refer to our privacy policy that says that we can use automated decision making using data on and off platform to determine your suitability. She had no clue why she was removed from the platform. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had no negative reviews. So she wrote back to them and said, I don't understand. I'd like to query this decision. And they wrote back to her and said, we've looked at it and you're removed from the platform and you have no right to redress, no obligation for them to disclose on what basis they made that decision, no transparency over the automated decision making that made the decision, and also no indication, for example, that she could correct the data if there was something incorrect because they didn't have to explain their decision. So I think this is like a really clear example from the consumer perspective. If they don't know what AI is being used, they don't have any rights currently under our current framework to reasons or explanation, and there was really no right to redress there for that customer. So obviously it's not great customer service, but really from the consumer's perspective, there's very little that they can do currently. And I think this is a really clear example of how to do AI irresponsibly when you're thinking about what consumers need to know. Because really, ideally, a consumer would have the opportunity to have an explanation of how that decision was arrived at, what kind of AI was involved, ideally what kind of data went into that AI, and an opportunity to correct the record if that was incorrect, and to challenge that decision where or not that should be on the platform. So I think, you know, being able to go on holiday with Airbnb is not the world's most dangerous example, but I think you can see as we see algorithmic decision making more prevalent in financial services, in people's access to home loans, in people's access to rentals. Choice also did some work recently on third-party platforms used in the rent tech sector. We can start to see how the fact that if you're not doing AI responsibly from the start, consumers can be harmed quite significantly, and it can impact their access to many, many services.
Thanks, Kate. What a great answer. Transparency and explainability are the new black for AI. So thank you for this fascinating explanation and the practical example, which lead me nicely into Eric's world. We've been talking about what responsible AI, transparency, explainability is so important and so key, and designing it responsibly for users. You working in the health sector, so what does it mean? Like, how do you do responsible AI? How do you put this in practice and to make sure, you know, to ensure patient safety in the health sector? This is the top concern, I'd say.
Yeah, absolutely, Aurelie. I think, you know, responsible and inclusive AI practices, they play a critical role. And, you know, not just for regulatory compliance, but really they're hugely important for the development and, you know, of safe and effective AI systems that actually works, that actually help end users and also benefit patients. So there are actually many factors to consider when it comes to responsible and inclusive AI, and it's good to know that, you know, Kate's already covered many of them, you know, that would also be applicable in the health sector. So I guess in the interest of time, I would like to maybe just highlight 4, you know, practices which I believe to be really important. So number one, you know, when we talk about responsible AI, you've really got to choose, I guess, the right performance measures, and you really need to validate your performance claims. So in other words, you really got to back up your claims. So for example, let's say, you know, you've developed AI diagnostic software, you know, which meets certain sensitivity and specificity benchmarks. Is it enough now to deploy the AI in a clinical setting? is that a responsible practice? I think it really comes down to your exact product claim. So for example, if you claim that your AI can actually assist doctors in relation to their diagnostic performance, then you must provide concrete clinical evidence to support that claim. And I think it'll be increasingly challenging for manufacturers to solely rely on bench testing or literature data without any direct clinical evidence. Another area I think, which is really important to consider, and I think Kate's already covered it, is transparency and explainability. And, not just transparency in the data set, but really explainability in terms of the AI output. So in other words, how or why did the AI produce such an output? This is especially relevant in the health space. So I guess with that being said, though, I think full explainability for complex AI systems, especially those complex neural networks or deep learning models, which can have millions, if not billions, of parameters, can be very challenging. And I actually don't think it's really helpful, for example, to provide the output of each, layer within your neural network to a consumer or to a regulator. Under normal circumstances, I don't think those are very helpful, but I do think developers need to consider other ways to provide reassurance or indications of confidence of the AI output. So for example, I've seen many manufacturers come up with things like heat map or some sort of scoring system based on the sigmoid output in the neural network. And there are many options the industry is exploring in the health space. And I think that the third practice, especially when we talk about inclusive AI, is really to implement processes to avoid bias. And really, I'm talking about unwanted bias here. And also, there are many different types of biases. And I think, one of the standards, or Aurelie, I think 24027, I think, from the SC42 gives a really nice overview. But here I'm really referring to data bias just in the interest of time. So, if we talk about unwanted bias, I do admit sometimes it can be very challenging to really know, what factors to consider, what factors might contribute to unwanted bias. So, for example, it might be relatively straightforward. Say if you're building a facial recognition system, I think most of us would know, perhaps ethnicity and age, would play a role. But what if you try to build an AI system to detect diseases now at the cellular level, right? If we go down to, say, the cellular level, how big of a role does ethnicity play? What about different image acquisition systems, different X-ray machines in the field of diagnostics? How much bias do they introduce? I guess my point here is that to answer those questions, I think you really need a multidisciplinary team, so including domain experts, medical professionals, and not just place, I guess, all the burden on your, AI engineers to figure it out. And last but not least, Aurelie, I think to create responsible AI and to be responsible, developers really need to think about deploying some sort of monitoring system post-deployment, in the real world, right? So you can't just deploy AI system and forget about it, right? I don't think that's really responsible practice. So one reason you want to be able to monitor real world performance is to be able to detect problems like data drift, right? So that's when you have, when the real world data may have a different distribution to, data that you've used in training or testing, which can then lead to inaccuracy. And also, more importantly, when you're retraining and retesting AI models, based on those real world feedback, you really need to consider processes to mitigate the risk of overfitting, right? So for example, by establishing some sort of process to control test data reuse. So yeah, I think that can be, its own workshop. And I guess in the interest of time, those are the key areas I just want to highlight when it comes to building responsible and inclusive AI in the health sector. Yeah, but there are many other interesting and related topics we can explore in this space.
Thanks, Eric. That's the top tips on AI. Like, I love the back your claim. Explainability is not just explaining the black box, it's explaining your risk management. As a lawyer, love that. Back your claims. And also, the second call you make, when we talk about bias, what we're really talking about is unwanted bias. There's bias everywhere in the current product. So what are the unwanted bias that we have to avoid? And the last one I'll summarize is, do not put all the burden on the data engineers. They're not building all the product on their own. So it's very much a multidisciplinary piece. So thank you for this really good summary. And whether we use LLM or AI, don't let them run wild. Check them, make sure you monitor them. That's also a very, very good point. Before I pass nicely to Sarah, I'd like just to call out that our next poll question has been input in the live chat. When it comes to responsible and inclusive AI, what is the main challenge you face or you observe? Which is when Eric's tip might come very, very handy. So make sure you put your comment. And as I say, we were just starting to talk about some of the responsible AI practice. So now I'll shift to Sarah. Sarah, from you, the engineer in the room, so give us your perspective on what does it mean to have responsible inclusive AI within your world.
Thanks, Aurelie. It's been really fascinating coming back into engineering from a much more consumer-focused world. In previous roles, there's been a lot of discussion about bias and inclusive and responsible AI around demographics and around people. When we come into the engineering world, the data sets we're looking at are much more in the space of IoT sensor data and around computer vision and around technical documentation. So some of the demographics and the people inclusivity is not there in the same way. But where we do ask a lot of questions is what could possibly go wrong. So we have a deep collaboration with our domain experts, and a lot of that is around the cost of a false positive or the cost of a false negative. So if we're doing a structural inspection that's using computer vision to look for defects, what happens if we miss one of those defects? What's the worst thing that could possibly go wrong? And therefore, what's the consequence of that risk? AI is inherently stochastic. It's not deterministic. And having a conversation around that with engineers, that what are we going to do in the cases where there is the potential for an incorrect decision or an incorrect prediction to get made is a really important part of what we do. So from an engineering perspective, having humans in the loop is really important. We like using AI as a guidance tool, as an acceleration tool, as providing insights and data to help drive human-made decisions. But in that world, I don't think we're ready to take humans out of the loop just yet. The front page of the age test is something we talk about a bit. I'd like to bring up a really interesting example that we have come across where we are using data with a known bias to create outcomes that we can generalize for overall community benefit. So this is some work that we're doing with our road safety experts, and we've got a client that we are going on a journey with to understand how you can use connected vehicle data to ascertain the effectiveness of road safety installations. So the layman's version of that is speed bumps. Where do you put them on the road? What happens to driver behaviour when you get over them? How do you actually measure whether they're making an effective change in behaviour or not? Up until now, that evaluation has largely been based on ATC data or tube data, commonly or affectionately known as licorice strips. So the things that you put out in pairs across the road, the cars go across them, and at one point in time, you've got an estimate of how fast the traffic was moving. And from that, you try and get an estimate of what happened over that road safety installation and have you made the road safer. There's a new form of data that's coming on the market, which is connected vehicle data. That is very carefully anonymised, privacy protected through a range of means, consolidated and served up to give insights on what vehicles are doing on the road, but you don't necessarily know which vehicle because we don't actually want to know who the driver is. So the responsible side of it is making sure that anonymisation is there and is in place. But this gives a very different statistical sample. ATC data gives you 2 to 5% maybe as a sample, but it's everything that's gone over that location for the duration that you've got those strips out for, which might be a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks at most. What you instead get with connected vehicle data is about 2 to 5% of the vehicles that are on the road, but everywhere, all the time. So we have a lot of wonderful conversations with our client about what is reasonable to extrapolate from the behaviour of drivers of new vehicles as opposed to older vehicles on the road. Where are they behaving in a similar way? Where are they behaving in different ways? And how does that bias compare with the bias you get from only measuring 2 days of the year in a particular location? So we have a lot of regular challenging conversations about what those samples mean, what the consequences of that bias might be. But we've been able to get some extraordinary new insights on how driver behaviour changes with and without a raised platform or a wombat crossing or a pedestrian refuge in a road. How much does the traffic slow down? Where does it start to slow down? How is that comparing to safe system speeds? If you put 2 of them along the road, how far apart should they be? So to do that, we've leaned into some past practice that they have about things called floating cars. So we've leaned back into other practice where in the past they've put out telemetried cars out on the streets, assuming that they would be influenced by other vehicles around them on the road. So in some cases, we can draw an inference. In some cases, if we were going to do a comparison between suburbs, and I live in Melbourne, so if we were going to do a comparison between vehicle behaviour in South Yarra and Cranbourne, and forgive me please if you live there, you'd probably get quite different behaviour between those 2 demographics because it is a very different driver age, it's a very different fleet age. If you wanted to estimate the comparative number of vehicles on those on the roads in those 2 different areas, that would not be a valid assumption. But if I wanted to look at how much I could change driver behaviour on a street in those suburbs by installing safety treatments, we can do that. So that's just an example of where we're thinking in that space. It is a different set of data and it's a different set of risks that get managed, but being inclusive, being inclusive is important, noting there are existing biases in the system that we're shifting away from and replacing with other biases. And then the responsible angle covers off what do we do when something goes wrong. Our domain experts are the ones who inform us around the cost and the consequence, the risk consequence of false positive, false negatives versus the advantages of getting it right. And then making sure that we are still anonymising and privacy protecting the source of that data so that we're getting the insight, but not necessarily creating risk for those consumers, to go back to Kate's point earlier.
Thank you, Sarah. This is, again, a really great example of what responsible AI practice mean with a very practical use case. And knowing that data is never perfect or complete, understanding the risk associated with promoting one bias versus the other, and keeping at all stages the human in the loop to actually understand which assumption we can make of the data. So thank you so much for this really interesting conversation. And with that human in the loop, as I say, we're having really great conversation. So you just talked about the importance of the human in the loop. So I can't help but shift now to Jonathan. You are working just on this topic. How do you keep human in the loop? How do you design a system taking into consideration the humans, because humans are not perfect too, we know. They also make mistakes. So how do we balance that human interaction? I think you've been looking at this, as you said, through the standards, but also through your work. So would love to know more how how do we do responsible AI when we consider human factor? Can you explain to us what are the human factor, human-centered design, and how they enable responsible AI and inclusive AI?
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's been a fascinating conversation. And in many ways, it leads up to what I'm going to say, except for the last bit. But first of all, I'll explain that. But first of all, I'm not totally sure whether we're all talking about the same thing. From the perspective we're taking in ergonomics, AI doesn't just mean machine learning. We go back to the old Simon and Newell definition, meaning anything that mimics some aspect of intelligence. And from a human-centered point of view, it's that perception that's important. I'll get back to that later in more detail. So computer technology was introduced in defense, process industries, transport, and now into the office and social interaction with the aim of enhancing human abilities to control things or data or time, i.e. partnering humans with technology, using each to augment the capabilities of the other. Now, because there is always an engineering focus and a lot of technical problems to solve, when we're close to doing the work, inventing and improving the product, we tend to forget that and concentrate on the system and technology aspects. But what we're delivering is ultimately, to be responsible, is for the benefit of humans and inclusive of as many humans as possible. So what are we doing in ergonomics? Now, thinking in this way, we see that artificial intelligence and machine learning are enabling, not driving technologies, same as communications and computers, etc. They should assist the industry and society in enhancing human and hence organizational or social capability. Now, human-centeredness was defined by my predecessor, the founder of SC4, as design from the human out. The human being is at the center of the working situation or the entertainment situation. We must understand the abilities, responsibilities, and requirements which people bring to that situation, not just their shortcomings, in order to be able to deal adequately with the system. So the properties, the capabilities that humans bring to a working system or an entertainment system or a social system is that they have purpose, they are purposive. They seek information. Because we have limited processing capability, unlike a computer, we always look to reduce uncertainty. And we're very, very good at that. Our brains are heavily adapted to reducing uncertainty. And most importantly, they are responsible. Human-centered design is from the viewpoint of the human being within a system rather than the system's requirements. And in putting a human in looking at the human viewpoint, we need to consider the whole person. What do they bring to an interaction or even any situation where we're going to use AI or machine learning? This includes their view of the system, its purpose, and their responsibility, their assigned responsibility within that system. And a lot of that's been covered today already. And the dynamic nature of the interaction with any system. In particular, the thought processes of people need to be studied, as well as the traditionally observable behaviors, like doing something strange on the train platform, or making a mistake, what was going on behind that slip, trip, mistake, etc. And full understanding must be taken of the values of people within that system, whatever they are. Now, in doing that, I'm building on everything that's been said, but I'm giving more responsibility to the designer even than has been explained. Both Eric and Sarah have talked about what they do within design, what they try and do to make sure they understand bias, what they try to do to understand how humans are going to interact. What I'm saying is, to do that properly, you have to put yourself into the head of the designer, and because you can't get there, you have to actually talk to them. You have to understand, you have to talk to people in order to develop a design or try things out. And trial and error is very important for human-centered design. Now, all of this is captured the principles and the process standards exist for human-centered design. In fact, the process standard follows the same format as the other IEC process standards that Aurelie mentioned at the beginning, and so that it can be combined with them. Quickly, in doing our preparatory studies for what we should be saying about human system interaction with AI, we identified 6 categories of system that humans might interact with. The first one is not actually interaction at all, it's being affected by the presence of such systems, how society changes, how expectations on people change. So, for example, rushing to get to work because your daughter's using television, you're being affected by the AI that's attracted her into watching it. Then, of course, human system interaction is the core of our thinking at the moment. But in future, it's not going to be interacting with one system, it's going to be interacting with many systems. How does their interaction affect humans, specifically and in general? And then, of course, we have what's the effect on organizations? What does it mean to start to use these technologies? And we're absolutely at the forefront now, socially, of doing something about that, thinking about that. Then, of course, we have to consider social, cultural, and ethical aspects and how different groups of people, and either socially or politically or culturally, will behave differently in response to the existence of systems that appear intelligent. And finally, we have the emergent social issues that there's a lot of publicity about at the moment when we start to look at large language models. The standards, briefly, the standards we've got, which are originally come from ergonomic standards, traditionally come from a work and productivity background, but living seems to have become more and more of a job to be done, and particularly in relation to technology. So we have we've written an overview of the issues, which is ISO 9241-810, and I'll make this available to you later. But we're just in the process of writing a guide, which should help everyone, a guide to the ergonomics of AI. We have the principles of ergonomics, both from an organizational perspective and from so in other words, what's a human-centered organization, as well as for a product. And that's where the process standards live. Then we have many standards for interaction interface, which already apply. Thought about accessibility, which extends into accessibility or universal design, which is bringing up the inclusivity aspect. Workspace and workload, how to design that, how to understand that, and then finally how to understand the environment and the context in which any system is used, because that has a very important effect on how people interact. So to summarize, support purposive information seeking, uncertainty reducing, and responsible values of humans. That's what we need to do. Sorry, long answer, but does that help?
That does help. Really great reminders that any tools that we build are built for humans in the first place, and just AI is no exception. So, and you've just given us a great overview of what it means to have social-technical system, and this is a perfect way also to illustrate what the key theme here. Inclusive and responsible AI is not one person responsibility. Involve your designer, involve your engineers, involve your lawyers, involve the customers. So that's, I think, a key message. And we've got some really great practical example on how to do it across different sectors. I'm going to ask one question to all of you. So you're all participating in the standards. So how has the standards work helped with those practices you're developing, and or how your practice have helped through the development of the standards? Do you anyone wants to answer this question?
I'm happy to jump in on that one, Aurelie, because the engineering world is full of standards. Things that have risk and safety have been guided by standards for many years. We have standards for how you build a bridge. We have design standards. We have safety standards around water treatment and what it should look like for something to work well. So the concepts of why standards are important to get quality outcomes are deeply embedded in engineering, and we're taking that concept across into how we think about AI in the organisation. GHD is an engineering firm. We engineer things that are robust, well designed, well built, and will last. And we want our AI systems to do the same. So for us, it's been a really natural translation piece across to help our engineers actually understand how we use AI, why we use AI, and what we need to do to make it safe.
Thank you, Sarah. Anyone want to add to this? Yes, Jonathan.
Yes, a recent project I've been doing is looking at how we properly do human-centered design as we start to use AI on ships. And that needs to lead to regulatory requirements, and we're in the middle of writing a code of practice. Now, in the automotive sector, there's a thing called the safety set being thought about, which is a set of safe behaviors which are understandable from a human point of view. And we've actually come up with a set of safe behaviors for an autonomous ship or system, and writing from the point of view of what is a safe behavior. So some examples of our criteria: it should be able to communicate its status and capability to the crew on the ship or other ships and shore services. It should be able to explain its intention. It should be able to recognize when it requires assistance. It should be able to request assistance. It should be able to put itself into a safe state, a state which doesn't present a hazard to the environment, other ships, fixed structures, or those rendering assistance. But on the other hand, because it is a ship, it's a requirement for it to render assistance to other ships and persons in distress. It also needs to protect itself from unauthorized access. Now, those are human understandable requirements. And it was possible to go from the trend in standards and thinking about who is affected under those criteria I mentioned earlier, to come up with a quite clear set of statements against which you can start to test or even start to regulate.
Thank you, Jonathan. This is really interesting conversation and really important one. Like, there's a lot of learning from automated vehicles and the design between the interaction, as now we're going to design more personalized experience. So I think this conversation about autonomous vehicle is actually very useful for the broader audience. Everyone that's using LLMs today, they see how they interact with those with ChatGPT and how it's pushing them to write one way or another or use one picture rather than another. So it's actually really this conversation on autonomous vehicle can be translated into many of our day-to-day use of AI. Before I go to the questions of the audience, I would like to mention that we have another poll question, which is what has or would help you advance the responsible and inclusive AI conversation within your organization? If you could please put your response in the chat, that'd be great. Thank you very much. So we have one question of the audience, like one of the top one is, it's great to see the development of standards and that they're available. What is done to ensure there is no duplication between the various standards? Anyone want to take that question?
Aurelie, I think you should take that one as chair of the committee, because you know the most about the coordination between the committees.
Thank you, Kate. Okay, I'll take the baton. First, we have liaison mechanism across standards. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the project, we have liaison with all the major international initiatives to make sure we work in sync with the EU Commission, with the Partnership of AI, with the OECD, the UNESCO. So we are not doing the work from start. And within our committee, the beauty of standards, it's a very well-oiled machine. We are building on existing standard. We're not reinventing the wheel. So if you have already risk management for organizations that are in place, usually following 9001 standards that you don't know because it's so used in the day-to-day. So let's say you're using that practices. We're not trying to do something completely new for AI. We set out what's the difference, what's the existing delta, what's the delta that you need to do to govern AI well. So, and same for data practices. So that's the way we avoid repetition, and we have liaison also with other standard organizations like IEEE. We have quoted reference to IEEE standard, and NIST is also referring to ISO standards. So there's a great coordination and complement, and the work is quite complementary. So that's the way we avoid duplication or inconsistency. As I say, the standards is a 100 years machine. That's a very well-oiled one. Happy if any of my fellow panelists wants to add anything that I've missed.
Aurelie, I would just like to add to that while we have extensive processes to identify and try and not to have that duplication happen, we don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. The aim, we get a lot of pressure that why does it take so long to get standards out there? How can we make them move faster? We push as fast as we can to get the standards out there, and there are iteration processes. So where there is a duplication or an inconsistency that does creep in, it gets looked at and it gets resolved. But the standards are written by humans, and we're stochastic too.
Love it, Sarah. One more question I've got for you is, who is ultimately, I love that question, who is ultimately responsible for being responsible with AI? What is the responsibility of technologists, developers, and consumer? All have a role to play. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Any views?
I'll jump in on this one because I think consumers are part of the equation there. Look, this is a great question, and I think it's important to think about, we're talking about responsibility and who can act responsibly, or who ultimately bears the responsibility or perhaps the liability if we're thinking about it in a legal framework. And I think everybody can contribute to building responsible AI. And I think Jonathan made that point very clearly, that this is not a single person's job in any type of organisation that is designing or developing or implementing AI, that there are many, many people who need to take responsibility. But ultimately, this, I believe, and I think this is probably a view supported by many, is that liability has to lie with the companies who are putting the product into the market, and ultimately that's the board directors and the company executives who need to take the liability question. You know, as I mentioned, consumers have very limited ability to interact with or to have control over the way that these products and services exist in the market, and that means more than in any case, I think it's important that board directors and company directors are responsible for ultimately the effects and the harms, and potentially when we're talking about governments, again, it should be the governments who are responsible for those harms, who bears the ultimate responsibility for a disaster like robo-debt. I think we can see that there are many people who could have acted responsibly, but the ultimate responsibility has to rest with the government of the day who implemented that very harmful system. If we've got time for one very quick cautionary tale about what happens when board levels and company direct levels are unaware of what's happening inside their business. So when Choice did the investigation into facial recognition use in retail spaces, we identified that Bunnings, Kmart and the Good Guys were using it unbeknownst to their customers. And on the day that story went out and went very big, it was everywhere. The Good Guys PR team actually denied that it was being used in their stores. And by the end of the day, the CEO is having to call up media companies and issue a public apology that in fact that was wrong, and they were using it. So what had actually happened was that a security team, when they were interested in upgrading their CCTV systems, had decided to, or had been sold by a vendor, the upgrade for a facial recognition system, and they had gone and changed the privacy policy and put it online. And that had happened unbeknownst to the senior executive and unbeknownst to the board. So that led to a very embarrassing egg on face moment. In their defence, the Good Guys did act very swiftly and shut down the trial, and that that ultimately meant that when the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner decided to open an investigation, that was only into Bunnings and Kmart, and the good guys escaped from the keen eyes of the regulator in that instance. But I think it's a really good example of that this really needs to come from the top in organisations, and that you might find yourself in a bit of a PR disaster if you don't take that responsibility seriously.
Thank you, Kate. And a good reminder is that there's already existing laws in place to govern AI. So there's already accountability from a legal perspective. So thank you. That's a great example. Just a few minutes if anyone wants to add to this. Otherwise, I'll try to sneak in one last question. Yes, Eric, you want to add to this?
Yeah, thanks, Aurelie, and thanks, Kate. I might just add some quick context specifically in the medical device context. So yeah, I fully agree. I think in the medical device context, there's this concept known as the legal manufacturer. So ultimately, they are responsible, for making responsible and inclusive AI. And I guess some of you might be wondering, well, what if the doctors or the end users misuse, right, the AI system? I think, again, the regulations and standards would require the legal manufacturer to consider those scenarios. So those are known as, foreseeable misuse scenarios, and then to put in place mitigation measures, appropriately. So first through design, and also, alarms, and finally, information in that order. So yeah, so I just wanted to add that quick context for medical device.
Yes, Jonathan?
We've been talking about safety-related systems. Can I just say online international? There's a whole wild west out there of as soon as you open your computer. And I think the regulatory aspects and the data protection aspects start to get much more fuzzy when you go behind the screen.
That's a good point. We see internationally the liability regime are also becoming stricter. So as I say, I think the accountability piece is becoming much more front of mind because we're going for stricter liability. So that's
Aurelie,
yes.
Just before we close off, sorry, everyone's got a view on this, which is fantastic. I guess mine comes from experience on being one of the people that was trying to get board and CEO approval to bring in AI in a particular product we were developing. In one of the roles that I've held, it is extraordinarily painful at the time to do it, but really, really important for whatever organisation that you're in, that there is some kind of ethics oversight, some kind of AI compliance committee that makes these decisions and has a register of them. Because if something goes wrong, this is the way we look after our company leadership. It's otherwise, if the boards have this responsibility and they don't have a process to get oversight of what AI is being done in the company and how it's being governed, that creates a ungoverned risk, which is not likely to have great outcomes at some point in time.
Thank you, Sarah. And this is the perfect final words to finish us this conversation. Oversight and accountability of AI are unavoidable. Shameless plug for our standards on governance on AI. That's already out. So have a look at the standards on AI governance. And thank you to our fantastic panel for truly impressive conversation about what it means practically in the day-to-day to do AI responsibly and inclusively. So thank you all for your participation today.